In the beginning, it all seemed harmless. A simple idea, a project meant to spark joy and a way to give the kids a place to play that was more than just grass and pavement. A backyard treehouse, nothing extraordinary, nothing more than what you might see in childhood movies or neighborhood nostalgia stories. The family's backyard wasn't especially large, but in one corner stood an old oak tree, tall and wide with branches strong enough to hold up something small. For years, that tree had been little more than shade in the summer and a pile of leaves in the fall. But with two kids growing restless during weekends, it became the perfect foundation for something more. At first, the construction was modest. Wooden planks nailed together, a small platform, a few boards to keep things from falling, and a ladder made of leftover timber from the garage. The kids cheered the moment they climbed UP the first time, looking out at the rest of the neighborhood from their tiny wooden balcony. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't big, but it was theirs. And in that moment, it became the most exciting spot in the entire house. But as with most stories of small joys, the problem wasn't the creation itself. It was the eyes that fell upon it. Across the fence on the other side of the property line lived the neighbor who never seemed satisfied with anything. She was the type who noticed if a lawn was a fraction of an inch too long, who measured paint shades against HOA guidelines, who reminded people of trash bin placement, and who had the HOA's number saved on speed dial. She was, in every sense, the neighborhood Karen. It didn't take long before her gaze fell upon the treehouse. She noticed it before anyone else did. While most neighbors either shrugged or smiled, she saw something she couldn't ignore. To her, it wasn't a harmless playhouse. It was an unsightly structure, a code violation, and worst of all, an unapproved modification. She wrote it down, documented it, and wasted no time in filing her complaint. The HOA board received her report almost immediately, and within a week, the family had their first notice taped to their door. The notice claimed the structure violated HOA guidelines on unsanctioned exterior additions and non-uniform backyard structures visible from common areas. It threatened fines, removal, and even legal escalation if the issue wasn't resolved. What was meant to be a sanctuary for children was now labeled a nuisance. The shock was real. The kids cried at the thought of their little fort being torn down. The parents felt the unfairness of it. After all, it was a treehouse, not a high-rise apartment building. But to the HOA, guided by the relentless pressure of Karen, it became a matter of rules and precedent. That was how it started, a war that no one had wanted, but one that couldn't be ignored. Instead of tearing it down, the family doubled down. They looked at the notice, looked at the treehouse, and thought about what it meant to be told that something innocent was suddenly forbidden. And in that defiance, the idea took root. If the HOA wanted to act like the treehouse was some great construction project, maybe it should become one. If Karen thought the little playhouse was too much, maybe she hadn't yet seen what too much really looked like. The decision wasn't instant, but it was inevitable. What began as a small act of rebellion soon became a full-blown plan. They went to hardware stores, looked up designs, and began sketching possibilities. What if, instead of a simple playhouse, it became a real cabin? What if the treehouse grew, expanded, and towered above the complaints? The kids, instead of crying, began to dream. They wanted a slide, a second story, maybe even windows and railings. Every new idea fueled the determination to build something grander. Construction began quietly at first. Extra boards were brought in, nails hammered late in the evening, and walls began to rise. The little square platform turned into an enclosed room. Windows were added, shingles nailed down, and a small door installed. Soon, it wasn't just a platform anymore. It was a cabin in progress. From the street, you could see its outline through the branches, and already it stood taller than most would have imagined. The neighbors started noticing, of course. Some smiled as they walked by, whispering about how incredible it was to see. Others shook their heads, predicting more trouble with the HOA. But Karen noticed the most. Every day she peered over the fence, her face souring with each new addition. Her complaints escalated, her calls to the HOA became more frantic, and she documented every single nail hammered into place. She thought the first letter would be enough. She hadn't expected resistance, and now, faced with expansion, she grew furious. The HOA, spurred on by her persistence, issued more notices. Each letter grew sharper in tone, filled with threats of daily fines, forced removals, and even legal fees if the unauthorized structure wasn't torn down immediately. But instead of intimidating, the letters only fueled determination. Each notice taped to the door was met with another weekend of construction. Each warning became another nail in the cabin walls. What was once a small act of defiance had turned into a mission. If they were going to be punished for building, then they might as well build big. By the end of the first month, the treehouse had become something extraordinary. No longer a platform, no longer just a small cabin. It had a staircase, a full second story, and even a wraparound balcony. The kids ran up and down the steps, their laughter echoing through the neighborhood. Lights were strung up along the roof, glowing softly at night, turning it into a beacon that could be seen from the street. It wasn't just a treehouse anymore. It was a two-story cabin suspended in the branches of the oak tree. A marvel of backyard ingenuity and stubborn resistance. Karen was livid. The HOA was overwhelmed. The neighbors were divided, some cheering quietly, others waiting nervously to see what would happen. And in the middle of it all, the family looked at what they had built and felt pride. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun. The HOA wasn't going to let this go. Karen wasn't going to stop. The fight was escalating and everyone knew it. But for the moment, as the kids leaned over the balcony railing and waved at the neighbors below, the cabin stood as proof of resilience. It stood as proof that sometimes the smallest joys, when threatened, could grow into something monumental. And as night fell, the glow of the treehouse lights lit up the street, casting shadows across the HOA notices still taped to the front door, ignored but not forgotten. The war had begun, and the treehouse was now a fortress in more ways than one. By the time a few weeks had passed, the two-story treehouse was no longer just a backyard addition. It had become a talking point for the entire neighborhood. People walking their dogs slowed down to take pictures. Parents carrying toddlers stopped by the fence, pointing up at the glowing lights strung around the balcony. Teenagers whispered about sneaking a look inside. What had started as a child's playhouse was now a symbol of rebellion, resilience, and creativity. But not everyone saw it that way. To the one neighbor who had started the storm, it was nothing but an abomination. From her back patio, Karen fumed daily as the sounds of hammering and sawing continued. The sight of wooden beams stacked neatly in the driveway made her blood boil, and the laughter of the children, echoing from a structure she insisted was illegal, was salt in her wounds. Her complaints to the HOA turned more aggressive. She demanded immediate enforcement, called emergency board meetings, and even tried to gather signatures from neighbors. She described the treehouse as a dangerous monstrosity, an eyesore, and a lawsuit waiting to happen. The HOA board, pushed and prodded, responded with renewed intensity. Soon, the family began receiving not just notices but fines. The first fine was small, a symbolic slap on the wrist. But when that fine was ignored, the amounts grew larger. Every week brought a new envelope with a higher number. The language grew harsher, threatening liens on the property, forced demolition, and attorney fees. To the HOA, it was no longer about one treehouse. It was about power, precedent, and their ability to control the community. But if the board thought money would stop the project, they miscalculated. The family paid no attention to the fines, tossing the envelopes aside. Instead, they poured more effort into the treehouse. They reinforced the structure with thicker beams, added new railings for safety, and even installed a slide that spiraled down to the grass below. At night, they wired solar lights along the roofline, making the cabin glow like a beacon above the neighborhood. It was no longer just for the kids. It was becoming a statement. The neighbors began to pick sides. Some, tired of the HOA's overreach, quietly admired the family's defiance. They dropped by to offer old furniture, spare tools, or encouragement. Others, worried about property values or future enforcement, muttered that it was reckless to challenge the board. The street was divided, and every passing day seemed to heighten the tension. Karen, meanwhile, escalated her campaign. She took photos from every angle, documenting the growth of the structure. She claimed it blocked her view, lowered her property's worth, and threatened the safety of every child in the community. She spread rumors that the treehouse wasn't structurally sound and would collapse at any moment. She even claimed she had trouble sleeping because of the string lights glowing into her windows at night. Her complaints grew so incessant that the HOA hired an inspector to visit the property. The man walked through the yard, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes as though he were surveying a high-rise. He measured beams, peered at bolts, and frowned at the balcony. But instead of finding damning evidence, he admitted quietly that the structure seemed stable, better built than many sheds or decks he had seen. That didn't matter to the HOA, though. They spun the report to emphasize unapproved construction and rule violations, ignoring the fact that safety wasn't the issue. The family, undeterred, kept building. They added a second balcony, this one facing the street. From that perch, the kids could wave at passing cars. They built a rope ladder dangling from one side, giving the structure the look of a small fortress, and with every improvement, the spectacle grew. It wasn't long before word spread beyond the block. Photos of the glowing two-story treehouse began circulating online. Someone posted a picture to a local community group, praising the creativity and spirit behind it. Comments flooded in. Some people loved it, calling it magical and whimsical. Others criticized the HOA for trying to crush something so harmless. Within days, the story spread farther. Small blogs picked it up. Local news outlets mentioned it in human interest sections. One evening, a camera crew even showed up at the edge of the street, filming the glowing cabin and interviewing neighbors. The kids, peering down from their balcony, couldn't believe they were suddenly part of something so big. To them, it was a dream come true. A treehouse that had become famous. To the parents, it was vindication. The more attention it got, the harder it became for the HOA to quietly sweep the matter under the rug. But with publicity came pressure. The HOA board, embarrassed and enraged, doubled down. They filed official legal notices, threatening to take the family to court. They began issuing fines not by the week, but by the day. They even sent letters claiming that the treehouse violated community harmony standards, a vague rule that allowed them broad authority to crack down on anything they didn't like. Still, the family refused to back down. Each letter was met not with fear, but with progress. When a new threat arrived, the parents responded by adding another feature to the treehouse. When fines increased, they painted the balcony railings bright colors, making the structure even harder to ignore. When the HOA called it unsafe, they installed extra supports and posted the inspection report online, proving otherwise. Every move by the board was met with defiance, and soon it became clear. This wasn't just about a treehouse anymore, it was about principle. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. On walks, people whispered about what might happen next. Would the HOA really take them to court? Would the treehouse be torn down? Or would the family win, showing once and for all that rules could be bent when they were unreasonable? The children of the neighborhood, meanwhile, began begging their parents for playdates at the famous cabin. The laughter that once annoyed Karen now echoed louder than ever, turning into a chorus of defiance. Karen's anger reached new heights, seeing families gather in the backyard, watching kids climb up the stairs, and hearing squeals of joy pushed her past the edge. She called emergency HOA meetings, stood up at community gatherings, and railed about how disrespectful it all was. She presented binders of photos, tall stacks of complaint letters, and endless tirades. But the more she fought, the more isolated she became. Neighbors began rolling their eyes, tired of her constant complaining. Some even mocked her behind her back, whispering that she was the villain of her own story. And then, in the ultimate act of defiance, the family announced plans to expand again. Not only would the treehouse remain standing, but it would grow larger. They planned to add an enclosed second room upstairs, complete with windows and a pitched roof. They envisioned turning it into a cabin with 2 separate sleeping areas, perfect for sleepovers and family nights. They even teased the idea of adding a pulley system to lift up snacks and supplies, just like in old-fashioned forts. When Karen heard, she nearly exploded. She stormed out to her yard, shouting across the fence, waving another HOA letter in the air. But by then, her voice no longer carried weight. Her anger had become background noise. Neighbors ignored her. Kids laughed at her. The HOA, though still threatening, realized they were fighting a losing battle in the court of public opinion. The war wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. The treehouse was now more than wood and nails. It was a symbol of resistance against pettiness, a testament to creativity, and a beacon of joy for the neighborhood. The family, once on the defensive, now stood tall. Their two-story cabin in the trees wasn't going anywhere, and as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the backyard, the cabin lights flickered on again. From the street, the sight was unmistakable. A glowing fortress high in the branches, children leaning over balconies, laughter drifting through the air. It was no longer just a treehouse, it was a landmark. The HOA's letters piled higher. Karen's complaints grew louder. The stakes climbed higher with every passing week. But one truth was undeniable. The treehouse had become unstoppable, and the final showdown was still to come. The transformation of the treehouse into a two-story cabin had already altered the balance of power in the neighborhood. What had begun as a simple children's play structure, small, quiet, and harmless, was now a towering symbol of defiance and creativity. The homeowner had resisted pressure, ridicule, and bureaucratic interference, and with every board nailed and every plank stained, the structure had grown not just in size, but in significance. It now stood as a beacon of possibility, proving that determination could turn even the harshest complaints into opportunities for greatness. Karen, however, could not accept this. From her window, she saw only a monument to what she considered disorder. To her, the cabin was a violation of control, a thorn in the side of her carefully curated sense of authority. She called the HOA more times than anyone could count, sending emails and leaving voicemails filled with frustration. Each message was tinged with urgency, as though the treehouse was not just an inconvenience, but a direct assault on the very fabric of the neighborhood. Yet the HOA's patience was thinning, and with each complaint dismissed or delayed, Karen's desperation grew. The cabin, meanwhile, flourished. What had started as a retreat for the kids evolved into a miniature community hub. Families brought their children to visit, and soon the cabin's yard became a gathering place for weekend picnics and late afternoon playdates. The children who once climbed nervously into the treehouse now moved with confidence, darting through the two stories, exploring secret nooks, and chasing one another across the rope bridges and platforms that connected sections of the cabin. Parents, watching from below, admired not just the structure, but the ingenuity behind it. As the weeks passed, additions to the cabin came steadily. Solar panels were installed on the roof, providing power for soft lighting that gave the cabin a warm, welcoming glow in the evenings. A pulley system was attached, allowing baskets of snacks and drinks to be raised from the ground to the second floor. Railings were reinforced, ladders were polished smooth, and the space transformed from an oversized playhouse into something resembling a tiny, functional home. Neighbors began jokingly referring to it as the neighborhood lodge. The children called it their kingdom. The cabin even attracted attention beyond the subdivision. Photos appeared on social media, shared by neighbors and visitors alike. Posts showcasing the creativity of the project spread quickly, drawing admiration from people who loved seeing a once ordinary yard transformed into something extraordinary. Comment sections filled with praise, with strangers online marveling at the boldness of the design and the resilience it represented. Turning complaints into masterpieces became a phrase repeated under many of the posts, and soon the story began to take on a life of its own. Karen's frustration only deepened with this new fame. To her, the treehouse-turned-cabin was never about creativity or resilience. It was about control slipping through her fingers. She had reported the structure with the expectation that it would be torn down, yet now it was celebrated. Each new addition mocked her authority, and each visitor who came to admire the cabin felt like a personal slight. Her resentment grew heavy, and with it came a determination to fight harder, no matter the odds. She sought allies among the HOA board, but many members had grown weary of her persistence. Some even admitted quietly that the cabin had done more good for the neighborhood than harm. Where there had once been quiet lawns and cautious interactions, there was now laughter, chatter, and gatherings that brought people together. The cabin had broken down the invisible walls between neighbors, fostering community in ways the HOA had never managed to achieve. And so, while Karen's complaints became louder, the board's support for her cause diminished. Despite her setbacks, Karen did not give up. She filed formal petitions, citing supposed safety hazards and violations of property guidelines. She even went as far as to bring in an inspector, hoping that an official ruling could topple what her words could not. Yet each time the cabin passed inspection, safety measures had been taken with care, the structure was sturdy, and nothing violated city regulations. The more Karen tried, the more it became evident that her fight was less about rules and more about personal bitterness. Meanwhile, the family behind the cabin embraced the attention with humility. They did not gloat or taunt Karen, even as her hostility grew. Instead, they focused on the joy the cabin brought to their children and the community. Weekends became festivals of sorts, with kids running through the yard, parents lounging in chairs, and laughter carrying across the block. The glow of the cabin lights at dusk became a symbol of peace, warmth, and defiance, transformed into beauty. It wasn't long before the cabin began to influence the culture of the neighborhood itself. Inspired by its success, other families started their own projects. One household built an elaborate garden with winding stone paths and benches. Another constructed a gazebo where neighbors could gather in the evenings. Slowly, the subdivision shifted from a collection of houses behind tidy lawns into a lively community that celebrated creativity and individuality. The cabin had sparked a quiet revolution. Karen, of course, saw none of this. Her world narrowed to the sight of the towering cabin just beyond her fence. Every day it stood, there was another day her will had been defied. She became known among the neighbors as the one person who could not let go, whose obsession with tearing down the cabin grew so intense that it overshadowed everything else. And yet, her voice no longer carried the weight it once had. Where once the HOA might have trembled at her complaints, now they sighed, rolled their eyes, and moved on. In the end, Karen's failure was sealed not by the cabin itself, but by the unity it inspired. Neighbors who had once been strangers now looked out for one another, bound together by shared gatherings and mutual admiration for the resilience that had given them the cabin. Children grew up with memories of adventures in the two-story structure, their imaginations shaped by the magic of climbing into a space that felt like their own castle in the trees. And through it all, the cabin endured. The story of the treehouse that became a cabin became folklore in the subdivision. New families who moved in would hear the tale from longtime residents, who retold it with a mix of pride and amusement. Karen was remembered as the antagonist of the story, while the cabin stood as proof that determination could turn opposition into triumph. As for the family who built it, they looked upon the cabin with a sense of quiet satisfaction. It was more than wood, nails, and ladders. It was a testament to resilience, a reminder to their children that when faced with unfairness, one could choose not just to resist but to create something greater. The cabin had outgrown its role as a playhouse and had become a symbol of what could happen when people refused to be diminished by negativity. Karen eventually retreated, her fight reduced to bitter muttering and the occasional glare. She never truly accepted the cabin's presence, but the neighborhood moved on without her. The cabin remained, lit at night, standing tall in the yard as both a refuge for children and a reminder to adults that beauty could emerge even from conflict. And so the story came to a close, not with the tearing down of the cabin, but with its triumph. What had started as a small treehouse became a two-story monument to creativity, defiance, and community. What had been born out of complaint blossomed into a legend, and what was once seen as a problem became the very heart of the neighborhood. The two-story cabin stood firm, not just in wood and nails, but in memory, spirit, and pride.